thanks for joining me this afternoon. I've made the shape of card that I'm going to make for you today. So it's another easel card. So get me with all my shaped cards, eh? I made one for you last week, didn't I? I'll just bring in the easel card that I made for you last week, or the shape that I made last week. This is one of the samples using the brand new Tetra stencil embossing folder from Lisa's shows on Sunday. So I made the easel like this last week, but while I was looking and doing a bit of research on this one, I also found this shaped easel. And I hadn't made one like this before, and I gave it a little go. And what I wanted to do actually, I've actually broken it down to make it a lot easier. Created it so we can actually use Lisa's nesting dies to make this. It saves a lot of the intricate cutting and folding. We are basically just using die cuts and creating apertures. And I'll just show you the back of it. The only difference that I've done, or the only difference in the way that I've made this, is that I've created the aperture and cut it directly from the card front, but I've actually then made a little belt to actually hold the mechanism together. Now, all the other templates that I was seeing online to create this, it would actually mean a lot more fussy cutting and measuring with you'd have to use a steel ruler and a craft knife from what I could see, where you would actually just cut out the top half and then the bottom half, and then you've actually left this part that the belt is actually allowing the two parts to hold together. You would actually cut this in, so it just looked really complicated. And if you wanted to make a straightforward card, but actually utilise the dies that we've got, which they're fabulous for matting and layering, great to put on directly onto your card as they are, but why not use them to make a job simpler? So I think, to me, I've managed to create the same type of card from what I've seen online using this method. So hopefully you'll find this a lot easier, and it will just open up a new style of card for you. So as always, easel cards are not the easiest thing to show with an overhead camera. So if I just tilt that a little bit for you. Also used one of the favourite embossing folders in the background, the padded quilt embossing folder here, which I believe Lisa has just got back into stock. So what I thought I'd do, I would stencil the robin for you. So I'm going to stencil in traditional Christmas colours. Then I shall go on to show you the construction of the card. There's not too many measurements to take down because what I am basing everything off is the nesting properties of the torn squares. Now, I'm using the torn squares because they're to hand and they're my favourite at the moment, but if any of the squares this will work for, and I have a feeling it would actually work quite well with the ovals and circles and even the rectangles actually. So I'm going to go traditional colours this time round, so greens and reds. So basically, you can either use a 6x6 card blank, which, as most of you will probably know, is my favourite shape of cardstock to use. And when I buy card blanks, that's generally the size that I buy. But this time round, because I wanted a green colour, a green base, I've actually created this from a 12x12 piece of cardstock. So this is American Crafts cardstock. I've used the middle-sized nesting square because it fits really nicely in the centre of the 6x6 card. We get a really nice border on there, and also when we just measure this up against our robin embossing folder, when we die cut it out, the robin sits nicely within that as well. So that's the reason I chose that size. I've also die cut myself, excuse the fact that this is die cut at the moment. I die cut myself, I cut myself the red layer to go on top. So assume none of this has been die cut at the moment. So I cut myself a layer of the lovely red to go on top, leaving myself a nice little border around the outside. So that was just cut with a trimmer, no die cutting. And then I took myself the middle-sized die and I ran this through the die cutting machine, so it cut 2 layers at the same time. And what that meant is that the aperture both in the red cardstock and the green cardstock is in exactly the same place. At this stage I haven't glued the cardstocks together, so they are completely separate, so by all means use a piece of low tack tape just to keep it all in place. But the trick to this is to make sure that the aperture of the red and the aperture of the green line up exactly. So once I've die cut that, this is what I was left with. I have myself a piece of red card and I have my card blank with the aperture in. Okay, so when we layer these up, those 2 apertures would meet up exactly. The next thing I've done, I took the next size up from the die that I've already cut with. Let's take that out. I've lined that up centrally around the aperture that I cut on the red, and I just die cut that again, so we end up with another frame. And the aperture on this red cardstock is now a little bit larger. So when we line this up back onto the front of our cardstock, make sure I put this the right way around. There we are. So when I line that up, we have a nice border around the outside. That's not lined up at all, I've moved it. There we are. There we go. Yes, so now we have a larger aperture which frames exactly the aperture on the inside. So you'll see where I'm going with that in a second. Now, if you weren't to make the easel card that I'm going to make, that in itself creates a lovely card blank. And I'm just thinking ahead here, just while I can. I created the section for the bottom of the card, which is basically the inside, with another red piece of cardstock to match the front, and I've embossed that with the Winter Forest 6x6 embossing folder. Now my intention is to layer that on the inside once I've made the easel card. But if you didn't want to go that far, why not just make a card like that? You have an aperture and you have, or even just set that aside. That in itself would make a lovely Christmas card, wouldn't it? And just how simple would that be? I think that's just really effective and just says Christmas all over in those colours. Anyway, I digress, so we'll come back onto that in a minute. That was just sort of an aside that I've noticed when I was putting this together. I get distracted by these little things. Okay. Now at this stage, we want to start creating the shape for this top easel. So we need to bring in a scoring tool. So we take our card blank. What we want to do, we want to score directly halfway down on both sides of this. So I know that this front of this card blank is 15 centimetres wide. So at 7.5, I want to create a score line there, and also follow that down to the other side of the frame and make a score line there. Then we want to make 2 further score lines at 2 centimetre increments. So from this line here, we go 2 centimetres across and we score, and 2 centimetres across again and score again. And we do exactly the same down on this other side here. So now we can actually fold those scores, fold the score lines. Obviously just be careful because it's gone a little bit off balance because we've got the aperture, but that is no worries at all. So we just need to make sure now that we've folded in the right orientation so the front of the card is in the right shape. There we are. So you can see now that we have this section that's already been made. Also need to do, we need to start thinking about how we manipulate our red layer to go onto the front here. So make sure that you have that the right way round, your nice borders, and it marries up exactly all the way round. I'm just going to make a little score line, or just a little mark here, which is where I want these score lines to go. And I'm going to bring my scoreboard back in again and just marry those marks up, the pencil marks up, with the score lines on the board so I know that they all fit together. So this is where I say it's like intuitive crafting really. I sort of just go with the flow and just make sure that everything sort of works together. So I'm just marrying up those score lines. Because this layer is just that little bit smaller, I didn't want to risk it by assuming it was just like 2 centimetres. So the easiest way is to offer up the 2 pieces of card together and use your marks that way. That way I always find that the dimensions fit a lot better than having to rely on measurements. It's the way I've always crafted. Hopefully that's something that you can follow as well. So I'm just going to make sure that these folds are folded in exactly the same way as the card. Just make sure that they're pressed down really nicely so we get a nice fold on there, and you can see now how this is mirroring the shape of our card blank. Just move that frame aside, we don't need that. So what we can do, we can start thinking about adding this onto the front of our cardstock. But before that I want to emboss this, just to add a little bit of detail. Now on this card I used a padded quilt, so I've used an embossing folder that gave an awful lot of pattern around the outside, so you can use whatever you have in your stash. As I say, for Christmas I think this padded quilt embossing folder would look amazing, but I'm going to use the Winter Forest. Now it's not going to give a huge amount of detail, but what it will do, it will just coordinate with the embossing that I'm going to put on the inside of the card. So I'm just lining that up. You can see we'll only be embossing where the frame is, so literally just down the side here, but it will just follow. So I'm just going to emboss that. I'll put that on the floor. So you can take that out. As I say, it's only a tiny little bit of embossing, but I think it just adds that point of detail around and the outside of the frame. So what I'm going to do now, before we get onto any of the stenciling, I will add this to the cardstock. We do get that extra border around the outside, so sometimes you may feel that it's nice to trim that off. Or if you've managed to line it up so it's really nice and even, it gives another dimension. It gives an almost faux matten layer to this layer as well. So what I'm going to do, I'm just going to make sure that the folds come back into place. And believe it or not, if you just gently manipulate that cardstock, it will remember where those folds are, even though you've embossed that piece of cardstock. So if you see there that just by gently folding that, the card remembers where I've scored. So although these score lines are less evident once you've embossed it, the cardstock is clever enough to remember it, so you can just see how easy that was. Now what I'm going to do, I am going to glue this frame to the green. Now I'm only going to do the top layer first, and again this is just back to this intuitive crafting, and I think I've done it last week also when I made my easel card. It's just the way that I find these things go together really well for me. So I'm just layering that first layer, that top half like that. Then I'm just going to fold those back and I'm going to trim. See, there's no measuring, so there's no error really there. I'm just going to trim that there so I know that that is an exact fit. Okay? And I'm going to do exactly the same with this layer down here. So I'm just going to put glue on these bits, and because I know where the score lines are, I know exactly where to put the glue. And I'm just going to add that layer to the bottom here. Just line it up to the folds that we've already created. You still have these tabs, so you have these as reference to line up with this part of the card, so everything lines up really nicely. And then, if you guessed, I am going to trim that there. And this is why I say I'm not given any measurements, because hopefully, if you can see, if that's intuitive enough to see where you need to go, we now have our frame, which lines up. If I lay it like that, our frame lines up nicely. We have our pieces that can pop into the centre there. Now it's entirely up to you whether you add the matten layer into these folds or not. Entirely up to you. I think sometimes we don't necessarily need it. But if you did want to add those, you do it in exactly the same way. And I will just add a little bit of glue. Not too much, because you need to have a little bit of flexibility there, because we're in a fold. So I'm just going to line that up with the two areas of the frame that are already there. Now you'll see that there is a little bit of overlap there. That's natural overlap, which is why we didn't want to add the red frame directly to the card blank, because those areas, this little overlap, would stop the mechanism from working properly. But if we add these little pieces on afterwards and trim away, you get a perfect piece, and the integrity of that fold won't be affected. Okay? Now you could of course create these so that they're a good 1/2 centimetre smaller than the rest of the frame, as you would do traditionally matten layer. But I think this way is far quicker. I think it's open to less error. But that is just me speaking from personal experience. So I think Dawn is far more versed and far more familiar with creating shaped cards, so she would possibly do it the more traditional way and do the measuring and create the mats and layers this way. But I think this way around, it takes a lot of the fear of measuring out of it. And if you've got yourself a good pair of scissors, I think you can create just as good a job as if you were measuring. So there we are, we have our matten layer on there. We have our easel card constructed. I will now add the bottom of the base. So I don't usually create cards this way around, do I? I usually do the stenciling first, but this time I'll do the card blank first. So I've already embossed this with the Winter Forest embossing folder. Now that embossing folder does of course come with a stencil, but we don't need to do that. We don't need to use the stencil today on the red cardstock. Just how Christmassy does that look? Doesn't that look lovely? We have the choice actually of which layer goes in the aperture there. I don't know which. I might actually go with red actually. I thought I was going to go with green, and I've therefore cut myself like the green little belt. But I think I might go for a red. So to add this now, we're not stenciling onto this, we're going to stencil onto a piece of white cardstock. But I'll show you how we add this in now. What we want to do is create our front of our card to go flat. And we just want to make sure that our aperture that we're putting back in corresponds. So make sure that the die cut fits back in the way that it came out basically. And this is the beauty of using the nesting dies, because it now has enabled me to change colour. And I know for sure that through the accuracy of the nesting dies that I can swap and change the colours about, which I think it just makes this style card a lot more open to lots of different ideas. So I'm going to make sure that that fits in there because we want a bit of free movement. And I've created myself a little belt to say ideally I would have possibly done this in red. But what you want to do is make sure that the width of this belt is certainly no longer or no wider than the width of your card blank. Again, if you're using a different size card, then you adjust it to that, which is why I don't want to give you the measurements again. But the width, or actually the depth of this, we don't want that to be any wider than one of these folds. Now these folds are 2 centimetres each. So I would say that you want this belt to be anywhere between 1.5 centimetres and 2 centimetres wide. You don't want it to be the full 2 centimetres because then that would mean it would sit on the actual creases, which again would affect the mechanism of the card. So I'm going to put my glue all the way across, because what we want this to do is to actually attach this die cut to the card blank. So make sure that your die in the aperture is lined up. Then you can add the belt and just make sure that everything catches. So I'll make sure it's caught on the green sections here, and I'll just make sure that it catches on the back of the aperture card there, the die cut in the aperture. So I'm just making sure that catches before I move it. There we are. So what we can now do, when we turn that around, we now have our section of our card that pops up in the middle, okay? And the whole card is able to lie flat to go into an envelope. So hopefully that makes an awful lot of sense. It's a lot more intuitive once you have it in front of you and you're using the nesting squares. It makes so much more sense because basically you're initially just creating yourself an aperture card and then you're adding this aperture in afterwards. And I think the key to this is adding this belt, which you would have otherwise had to have fussy cut in. And to me, that was open to a lot more error. Whereas this way round, I don't think you can go too far wrong, and you have a fabulous shaped card there. And I don't actually think particularly that this type of easel card needs a stopper, actually. I think because of the nature of it, it sort of naturally sits and keeps its shape as it is. Okay, so now we've done that, we can get on to some stenciling. So to stencil the robin, I'm using Lisa's Super Smooth cardstock, and I've die cut it with the largest of the torn square apertures. Let me just show you the front of this. These are the nested stitched torn squares. So this is the set that I've been using. So I'm just going to line up my torn square under the first stencil here, just to make sure that our little robin friend sits squarely in the centre there. Okay, so we start stenciling stencil number 1, and we start going in with the foliage. Let's bring in the stencil there so you can see where we're going with that. Okay, yeah, let's leave that there. So Woodland Moss is always my go-to for a green. I'm looking forward to having the new inks come through. Won't be long now, I don't think. Just waiting for my post. It takes a little bit longer over here to Ireland. But Woodland Moss, I love. I really enjoy using that. So we have the foliage going down first, and there's always the first layers, which are the ones further back in the image. I always go darker. So we'll just lay down this colour. Actually, with making these Christmas cards for you on the lives this year, I might actually be really organised for Christmas this year. Usually I get to Christmas and I haven't done very much at all. Okay, so we have our leaves. What I want to do, just before we carry on, I'm just going to come back to stencil number 1. I'm going to pop that on gently. I want to make those leaves just a little bit darker. So I'm going to bring in a stencil brush, and just with the tree bark, just a tiny little bit of brown ink, I'm just going to come in and add a little bit of shadow, just to make sure that that layer is sufficiently different to the leaves on stencil number 2. Don't you really need to add very much, so don't go overboard. Just make sure that you can still see enough green that you've already stenciled. And you don't need to put the brown through the whole of the aperture, just sort of touch the edges of it. And I think what that will do is just make that bottom layer pop a little bit more. Can you see the difference in that? I'm happy with that now. And I do find I do that sometimes. I do swap backwards and forwards between stencils. Sometimes when the image is finished and I think I need to just highlight something a little bit more. Okay, so now we have the flower. This is the cherry bomb, so I'm going to reach over, excuse me, get my blending sponge, because remember the interference inks work better with these blending sponges. So I'm going to just put that through, just really lightly through that aperture. Actually, I'm just thinking on my feet here, I might actually... Who thinks it might be a good idea to have little blending sponges, little smaller ones, so we can do fine detail with the interference inks? Because these blend just as beautifully as our matte blending inks. So to create some techniques, it might be nice just to have and create, you know, pick out little details. It might be nice to have a slightly smaller blending sponge, wouldn't it? I wonder if that's something that Lisa could do. Don't know. I might be talking out of turn there, but it's just popped into my head. Because I do like to blend with these, and you can get lovely blends with the interference inks. So I'm going to go a little bit darker on the berries here, because we want some of that mica to really come out, don't we? Again, I'm going quite light on the flower, because I know I've got extra detail to put up on top of that, but because I'm going quite light, it won't necessarily show the mica. So I'm going to make sure I put the mica, or the interference ink heavier through the berries, so we've got, I think we get a nice gold, or purpley gold come through on this one, don't we, with the cherry bomb. So that looks lovely. That should go nicely with our red background. So we stick with our poinsettia. So definitely going darker this time round. This is where we can start building up that colour and see that interference properties really come in. Okay. Such a pretty colour, this cherry bomb. Okay. There we are, we have a few more berries here, so make sure we put those in really dark. Okay, I think some of these berries, if you look on the packaging there, the leaf is actually done in purple. So I might, actually in a second, let's have a see. Let's get some of the crushed velvet here, and I need to get my other sponge. And this is where I'm thinking on my feet again. Galaxy Dream, where's the... There we are, crushed velvet. So let's just add a little bit of extra colour to them, shall we? These ones down here, just make them look a bit different. God, it's a lovely rich colour, especially when you layer it with the cherry bomb there. How pretty. Okay. I'll just do a little swipe of ink up on those as well. There we are. Oh, that makes a difference, doesn't it? Look how pretty that is. Let me just move that aside. Okay. Right, so where are we now? It looks like we're coming in to start creating the robin. Ah, look, we've got a few more berries. Let me just go straight in with the berries, straight with that purple. Whoa, look how rich that is. Oh, I'll just put my fingers in it. There we are. So excited I'm getting with this stenciling today. Okie dokie. Right, so what I'm going to do now, I'm going to stencil the robin's redbreast here, our red robin. I'm going to use these brushes. I don't use orange and red an awful lot myself, only small accents, and for those small accents I use stencil brushes and not the Wonder brushes. So these are Wonder brushes. The bristles are exactly the same but in a different handle, so these are called bijou brushes, and so for those colours actually that I find I don't use all that often, especially the bolder colours, the reds and the oranges, I haven't allocated Wonder brush to those, but I have the bijou brushes. I'm going to start off with a bit of orange, because if you actually look at a robin, they aren't pure red. And especially when you see them in their mating plumage, rather, when they get really bold. They're lovely, lovely birds, full of character, but they aren't just a pure red. So I'm going to give it an undertone of orange and then come in with the second bijou brush. Say red isn't necessarily a colour I use a huge amount, and just come in and then blend in the red over the orange. And that will just give this robin just a slightly different look, and also make it look like a very different red to the poinsettia there. So you can see with these brushes, they blend just as well as the Wonder brushes, but they're just in a slightly different format, that's all. So now we can come in with our Wonder brush with the tree bark. So we have his wings sitting there and his legs. So I'm going to put the basis of his colour on with the brush here. Really make sure that goes on quite bold. And then, once I'm happy with that colour, I'm catching his beak there as well, which is no problem whatsoever, because I want the top of his back to be a lot darker, so therefore his beak will get included in that. So I'm going to make sure I'm going a lot more top heavy with the colour, downwards, and then I'm just going to make sure that that is much darker by coming in with the stencil brush and really bring that down into the top of his wing there. So we've got a lovely colour, and then make sure that the base of his tail is a lot darker because we want that to stand out amongst the flowers, don't we? Okay. So there we are, he's coming to the front. Right, we have details in the leaves here. So for that I'm going to come back. Now I will use my stencil brush this time round because I want a lot of colour to go down. And I'll just add those details into the leaves. Now even when I do this sort of detailing, I don't add the full amount of colour through the whole of these leaf details, and you'll see in a second when I take this away that we still get some graduation of colour, and I think that just makes it a lot easier for the shading. Like some areas it really sort of does go dark and it tapers off. I think it just gives us a really nice blended look when we do that. Right, so now we're on to our last stencil actually. So we want to have his head a lot darker than the rest of his body. So I'll make sure that I come in with the tree bark again, go quite heavy on there. Make sure I don't catch his body actually, because we want that to be a lot paler. So once I've added the colour with the Wonder Brush, I can come in with a stencil brush and just add even more ink to the top of his head, and just coming down into the nape of his neck there and just keeping that quite pale. We'll make sure we stencil that darker detail into his wings and obviously the base of his little beak there. Okay, now for his body we can go one of two ways. Let me think. I am going to come in with the almond frosting. And I'm going to do this really gently initially. Make sure I blend that away. I'm going to come in with the almond frosting and be really gentle with this. And I'm just going to come with some downward strokes, just like this. And what that does, it actually keeps the integrity of the brush stroke. Okay? Now we're going to add detail onto this when we run this through the embossing folder, but you can add to that by not giving yourself a fully blended section with your ink. What you want to do is just try and keep some of those brush strokes. So a really tiny bit of ink and just really light flicks of that brush enables you just to keep a bit of texture just with the brush there. If I pull that away, you can see that difference in colour. You can see sort of slight areas that are a bit darker, but you still can see those brush strokes, and I think that's a really clever technique to use as well. Just, you know, use the texture of your brush to create extra dimension on your image. Right, now I'm just looking at that. We were chatting away. I forgot to add the detail into the flowers, didn't I? So if I come in with the cherry bomb again, so we can add the detail on the flower, and that's going to be really heavy, so that's going to have a lot of mica there. And then we want the branch of the flowers to be dark, so we'll come in with the tree bark. Okay, let's see. There we are. So we've nearly finished now. We've just got some tiny little details actually. So I'm going to tiny little details to the edge of the berry. So I'm going to do that in the tree bark. So that will just be nice little accent points on there. Okay. So there we are. That's our finished stenciled image. Lovely and bold. Really Christmassy. Right, now what we need to do, we need to cut this down to size, don't we, so it fits on our card blank here. So we want to, we can do it one of two ways actually. We can either use the same size die as the aperture that we cut there, or we can go for one size smaller, which I think will work. It will get most of the flower and it will get the little robin for us, of course, and then it now allows us to mat and layer onto the onto our card blank. I think what I might do, thinking about it, I'm going to cut with the two dies, because if you see what I've done here, I've actually done that and it's given us an extra layer and allowed us to have more detail of the flower on there. So let me just make sure that I've got those lined up properly. We want these squares to correspond with each other. That's right, there we are. So this is part of the stenciling that we're not using, so we're not actually wasting too much of what we've stenciled already. But we do have the image with an outer frame. So I'm just going to make sure that those are lined up with each other with a tiny amount of tape, just to make sure that they don't move. And if you do this on the back, it's not going to affect your image. So if I line this up on in the embossing folder, I'm actually quite looking forward to seeing him come to life now. Just make sure that's lined up. See the detail that we've got in there, you can just see little feathers and picked out now, so that is just super pretty. So what that has done now is actually given us options on how we want to mount this on here. You can either mount this directly, we can have that on there, or we can put the robin straight on there and he has the red as a border. So I will use 3D foam tape, which there is, so we can get even more dimension. So I'm not going to glue it flat on there. The nature of the card means that I can actually have dimension even on the easel section of this card, so we're going to make the most of that. I'm going to put 3D foam on, and you can see actually by cutting it smaller, we didn't waste too much of the areas that we've stenciled at all. You could have stenciled actually onto a smaller die cut square to start with, but I think that way you sort of risk not lining it up properly, and I think it gives you the option to fussy cut when you actually if you stencil the whole image, then you can choose where you die cut it afterwards. So make sure that that's on there, and there's our little robin that stands proud. As I say, I don't think we really need an easel stopper on this card, but I'm just going to add a little sentiment just from Lisa's Christmas sticker collection. I don't think it needs much more than that. You don't want to overpower him. So we can have Merry Christmas wishes. Although they are stickers, we want to put that up on 3D foam. I mean, that would look lovely on there as well, wouldn't it? The other thing you could do actually, which I've used one of the other die cuts when I was prepping the cards before, you could also add a die cut into the centre there and add that up onto 3D foam. That would work also. But if I think, I'm just going to add that below the tree line there, and that would work just as a stopper. As I say, I really don't think it actually needs it, to be honest, but you do need a sentiment on there, so you might as well make the sentiment work and have a place on the card. So that's our alternative easel card. I really like this one. This one is nowhere near as tricky as it would appear. Make Lisa's dies work for you. I think that it made that come together a lot easier, and it's probably something that I will definitely use again for sure. Thanks so much for joining me today. Enjoy the rest of your week, everyone. Join you again next week. Take care, everyone.